If you were to look at the Hastings family Christmas cards from the last 2 decades, you would immediately understand the dynamic. In the center, radiant and professionally styled, stood my sister, Beatrice. To her left, our mother, Patricia, looking at Beatrice with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious deities. To her right, our father, Robert, smiling passively. And then there was me, Chloe, usually positioned slightly out of focus in the background, wearing whatever hand-me-down sweater Beatrice had deemed too tragically last season to keep. Beatrice was the golden child. It wasn't just a family joke. It was a fundamental law of physics in our household. Gravity pulled things down, the sun rose in the east, and Beatrice was destined for greatness. She had the glossy blonde hair, the effortless charisma, and the uncanny ability to manipulate any situation to her advantage. She coasted through a prestigious liberal arts college on her charm, landed a highly visible job in luxury public relations, and, the crowning achievement in my mother's eyes, married Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was old money, the kind of money that didn't just buy yachts, but bought the marinas the yachts were docked in. He was the heir apparent to Pendleton Global, a mid-sized but incredibly lucrative logistics and supply chain empire. When Beatrice married him, my mother acted as though we had officially joined the British royal family. I, on the other hand, was the practical one. That was my mother's polite euphemism for boring and unremarkable. I didn't have Beatrice's flair. I went to a solid, unglamorous state university, got a degree in finance, and went to work in the grueling, invisible trenches of corporate mergers and acquisitions. For 6 years, I worked 80-hour weeks at Sterling Vanguard, a ruthless private equity firm in Manhattan. I survived on stale espresso, spreadsheets, and sheer, stubborn willpower. I didn't have an aesthetic Instagram feed. I didn't summer in the Hamptons. I lived in a cramped apartment in Queens and systematically clawed my way up the corporate ladder, entirely under the radar. My family knew nothing about my actual career. Whenever they asked, Beatrice would interject with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "Oh, Chloe's a number cruncher. She does data entry for some accounting place. It's very stable." I never corrected them. The few times I had tried to explain the complexities of leveraged buyouts or corporate restructuring, my father's eyes would glaze over, and my mother would loudly change the subject to Beatrice's upcoming trip to Milan. Eventually, I learned that my silence was the price of peace. But peace is a fragile thing. The catalyst for the explosion was Arthur's 35th birthday. Beatrice had spent 3 months orchestrating a dinner party at their sprawling estate in Connecticut. It wasn't just a birthday. It was a networking event, disguised as a celebration, filled with Arthur's wealthy friends, potential investors, and reluctantly, our family. My mother called me a week before the event, her tone vibrating with that familiar, frantic anxiety she only exhibited when Beatrice's social standing was on the line. "Chloe, you are coming on Saturday, correct? Beatrice has put so much work into this. They are having Dover soul-catered from that place in the city." "I'll be there, Mom," I said, rubbing my temples. I was sitting in my office at 9 o'clock at night, staring at a mountain of due diligence reports. "Please wear something presentable," she continued, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Arthur's business associates will be there. Gregory and Fiona Townsend are flying in. We don't need you looking like you just rolled out of a cubicle. Just try to blend in, darling. Don't embarrass your sister." Don't embarrass your sister. It was the mantra of my childhood. "I'll wear the navy silk dress, Mum. It's fine." What my mother didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that I wasn't just sitting in a cubicle. For the last 8 months, I had been the lead strategist on Project Labyrinth, the largest acquisition target in Sterling Vanguard's history. My mentor and the firm's senior partner, Sylvia Carmichael, had trusted me with the entire deal. It had been brutal. Countless sleepless nights, ruthless negotiations, and navigating a minefield of corporate egos. But we had won. Just 2 hours before my mother's phone call, Sylvia had walked into my office, poured 2 glasses of scotch, and handed me a signed contract. Along with the successful buyout, she handed me a letter of promotion. At 28, I was officially the youngest senior vice president of acquisitions in the firm's history. I was going to be running an entire division, backed by billions in capital. And the absolute sweetest, most twisted irony of it all, the company we had just ruthlessly acquired, the failing, debt-ridden entity we had just bought out from under its incompetent board of directors, was Pendleton Global, Arthur's company. I hadn't targeted them out of spite. It was strictly business. Pendleton Global had terrible management, bloated overhead, and prime assets that were being squandered. Arthur was a nepo baby playing CEO, and he had run his grandfather's legacy straight into the ground. Sterling Vanguard had swooped in, bought up the majority debt, and forced a hostile takeover. As of Friday afternoon, Arthur Pendleton no longer owned his company. I owned him. I hadn't planned on saying anything at the dinner. I was going to let Arthur discover the identity of his new corporate overlords on Monday morning, during the mandatory restructuring meeting I had scheduled. I was fully prepared to sit at that dinner, eat my Dover sole, and play the quiet, boring sister one last time. But Beatrice, as always, couldn't just let me exist in peace. The Pendleton estate was an exercise in aggressive wealth. Driving my sensible sedan up the half-mile gravel driveway, flanked by towering manicured oaks, I felt like a peasant approaching a feudal castle. The driveway was already lined with an armada of matte black Range Rovers, Porsches, and vintage Mercedes. I parked my car as far away from the front door as possible, taking a deep breath before stepping into the lion's den. Inside, the house smelled of expensive cedar, roasted herbs, and pretension. A string quartet was playing softly in the grand foyer. I found my parents immediately. My father was clutching a highball glass, looking incredibly uncomfortable in a tailored tuxedo, while my mother was buzzing around the room, essentially acting as Beatrice's unofficial hype woman. "Oh, Chloe, you made it," my mother said, looking me up and down. I was wearing the navy silk dress, paired with a subtle pair of diamond studs I had bought myself to celebrate my promotion. Her eyes caught the diamonds, narrowing slightly. "Are those?" "Cubic zirconia." "Honestly, Chloe, it's a bit tacky for this kind of crowd. You should have borrowed something from Beatrice." Before I could reply, Beatrice glided over. She was a vision in emerald green satin, a massive diamond resting heavily on her chest. She kissed the air next to my cheeks, enveloping me in a cloud of Le Labo perfume. "Chloe, I'm so glad you could take a night off from your little spreadsheets." Beatrice beamed, her voice carrying just loud enough for a nearby group of men to hear. "I put you at the end of the table next to Cousin Greg. He's an actuary, so you two can talk about calculators or whatever it is you do." "Thanks, Bea. Happy birthday to Arthur," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Arthur appeared behind her, sliding an arm around her waist. He had the kind of handsome, deeply tanned face that usually belonged to men who spent more time on golf courses than in boardrooms. He gave me a condescending smirk. "Chloe, good to see you. Glad you could step out of the middle class for an evening." I smiled back, a genuine bright smile that clearly unsettled him for a fraction of a second. "You have no idea, Arthur. It's going to be a memorable night." Dinner was served in a formal dining room that could have comfortably seated 30 people. Crystal chandeliers gleamed overhead, illuminating the long mahogany table. I was indeed seated at the far end, in the social equivalent of Siberia, next to socially awkward cousin Greg and a deeply bored-looking woman named Fiona Townsend, whose husband was apparently one of Arthur's key investors. For the first hour, everything proceeded as normal. The wine flowed, the Dover sole was served, and the conversation was dominated entirely by Arthur and Beatrice. Arthur was holding court, loudly bragging about Pendleton Global's aggressive expansion strategies. "We're pivoting," Arthur declared, swirling his heavy Cabernet. "The supply chain sector is volatile, but I've got my team streamlining operations. We're actually looking to bring on a few exclusive equity partners by Q3. The valuations we're projecting are off the charts." I took a slow sip of my water, masking my amusement. It was a fascinating performance. I knew for a fact that Pendleton Global was bleeding cash. They hadn't hit a projected valuation in 3 years. Arthur wasn't looking for equity partners. He had been begging for a bailout, which was exactly why his board had caved to Sterling Vanguard's buyout offer behind his back. He didn't even know the ink was dry yet. Beatrice, sensing that the spotlight was drifting from her, suddenly clinked her fork against her crystal wine glass. The gentle chiming cut through the low hum of conversation. The table fell quiet, faces turning toward the golden couple. "Before we do the toasts, I just want to say how incredibly proud I am of my husband," Beatrice announced, her eyes sweeping the room, making sure everyone was paying attention. "Arthur carries so much responsibility. Running an empire isn't for the faint of heart." She then let her gaze slowly travel down the length of the long table, past the wealthy investors, past our beaming mother, until her eyes locked onto me. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. "It really takes a special kind of drive," Beatrice continued, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "A drive that, frankly, not everyone has. Right, Chloe?" The entire table shifted. 30 pairs of eyes suddenly swiveled in my direction. I felt the familiar, heavy weight of my family's collective judgment settle on my shoulders. "I suppose it does, Beatrice," I said evenly. "I mean, look at my little sister." Beatrice sighed dramatically, addressing the room as if I were a tragic charity case. She works so hard at her little clerical job, typing away, organizing files, fetching coffee. It's honest work, of course. But Arthur and I were just talking the other day about how sad it is to see someone with so little ambition. My mother gasped softly, but didn't intervene. My father looked down at his plate. "Now, Beatrice," Arthur chuckled, playing the benevolent patrician. "Don't be too hard on her. The world needs cogs in the machine. Without people like Chloe processing the paperwork, visionaries like me couldn't operate." A smattering of polite, uncomfortable laughter rippled through the guests. Fiona Townsend gave me a pitying look. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. For 28 years I had swallowed these insults. I had shrunk myself to keep the peace. I had let them paint me as the dull, unremarkable background character, because I thought protecting my mother's fragile ecosystem was the right thing to do. But looking at Beatrice's smug face and Arthur's arrogant smirk, I realized something vital. They didn't just want me to be unremarkable. They needed me to be a failure so they could feel superior. "It's just that it's embarrassing, honestly," Beatrice pressed on, clearly emboldened by the audience and my silence. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands. "Mum and Dad gave us both the exact same opportunities. And while I'm helping Arthur build a legacy, you're the family embarrassment, Chloe. Sitting in a cubicle, going nowhere. Don't you ever feel ashamed when you look at what we've built?" The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the polite quiet of people listening to a toast. It was the suffocating, electrified silence of a room that had just witnessed a public execution. The air in the room felt thick, choked with the cruelty of her words. I didn't flush. I didn't look down at my plate. I didn't cry. Instead, I reached into the sleek leather clutch resting on my lap. I pulled out my phone, unlocked it, and found the PDF attachment Sylvia had emailed me before I left the office. I looked up, meeting Beatrice's triumphant gaze, and then shifted my eyes to Arthur. "Ashamed?" I asked, my voice completely calm, carrying clearly across the dead silent room. "No, Beatrice, I don't feel ashamed at all. In fact, Arthur and I actually have a lot more in common regarding his legacy than you think." Arthur let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed awkwardly against the crystal glasses and silver platters. He looked around the table, inviting his wealthy guests to join in on the joke, but the atmosphere had grown decidedly frosty. People like Gregory and Fiona Townsend didn't amass their fortunes by ignoring a sudden shift in the wind, and the wind had just violently changed direction. "You and I have a lot in common regarding my legacy," Arthur repeated, a condescending sneer firmly planted on his face. "Chloe, please, don't embarrass yourself further. I know Beatrice was harsh, but making up delusions of grandeur isn't going to save face. What, did you process a payroll check for one of our vendors?" "I don't process payroll, Arthur," I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing any trace of the polite, accommodating sister I had played for 28 years. "I am a senior vice president of acquisitions at Sterling Vanguard." The name dropped like a lead weight in the center of the mahogany table. Fiona Townsend, who had been lazily stirring her espresso, froze. Gregory Townsend's head snapped toward me, his eyes suddenly sharp and calculating. They knew exactly who Sterling Vanguard was. Anyone who operated in the upper echelons of East Coast private equity knew Sylvia Carmichael's firm. We weren't a boutique agency. We were an apex predator in the corporate ecosystem. Arthur's sneer faltered for a fraction of a second, but his ego quickly overrode his logic. "Sterling Vanguard? Never heard of them. Some mid-tier firm, I assume? It doesn't matter. You have absolutely nothing to do with Pendleton Global." "Actually, Arthur, I have everything to do with Pendleton Global," I replied, smoothly sliding my phone across the pristine white tablecloth until it rested directly in front of his plate. The screen glowed, displaying the crisp, undeniable PDF of a finalized contract. "Because as of 4 p.m. yesterday afternoon, Sterling Vanguard acquired a 68% controlling interest in your company." Beatrice let out a high-pitched, incredulous scoff. "Chloe, stop it. This is pathetic. You're ruining Arthur's birthday with this psychotic prank." She turned to our mother, her voice shrill. "Mum, make her stop. She's acting crazy." My mother, looking like she was going to hyperventilate, clutched her pearl necklace. "Chloe, sweetheart, please. You're drinking too much wine. Let's just go to the kitchen and—" "I haven't touched my wine, Mum," I interrupted, never breaking eye contact with Arthur. Arthur looked down at the phone. He didn't want to look, but human nature compelled him. His eyes scanned the first few lines of the document. I watched the exact moment the blood drained from his deeply tanned face. The smug patrician glow vanished, replaced by a sickly, ashen grey. "You're lying," Arthur whispered, but the bravado was entirely gone. His voice shook. "This is a forgery. My board would never approve a buyout without my authorization. I am the CEO. I am the majority shareholder." "You were the majority shareholder, Arthur," I corrected him, leaning back in my chair, resting my hands comfortably in my lap. until you leveraged 40% of your personal shares to cover the massive, gaping holes in your Q2 and Q3 operating budgets. You took out mezzanine debt from a shadow lender to keep up appearances and fund this lavish lifestyle, hoping you could secure a bailout before the fiscal year ended. A collective gasp rippled through the table. I saw Cousin Greg, the actuary, physically shrink back into his chair, realizing he was caught in the crossfire of a corporate massacre. "We bought that debt, Arthur," I continued, my voice steady, merciless, and calm. "Sterling Vanguard purchased your debt for pennies on the dollar 3 weeks ago. Once we held your personal leverage, we approached your board of directors, Harrison Gable and Richard Thorne." Arthur flinched at the names of his 2 oldest board members. "They were terrified, Arthur. You've run Pendleton Global into the ground over the last 4 years. The bloated overhead, the disastrous pivot you were just bragging about, it was bleeding the company dry. When I presented them with a premium buyout offer that would save their own equity and prevent a total bankruptcy, they didn't just agree. They practically begged us to sign." "No," Arthur stammered, pulling at the collar of his custom tuxedo shirt as if it were suddenly choking him. "No, Harrison is my godfather. He would have told me. Harrison has a fiduciary duty to the company's survival, not to your ego," I said. "And as of yesterday's emergency proxy vote, which you were conveniently not invited to because your shares were already seized as collateral, the deal was finalized." I took a sip of my water, letting the silence stretch. "I have spent the last 8 months mapping out exactly how poorly you manage your assets," I told him softly. "I know about the corporate jet you lease, despite the travel budget being slashed. I know about the consulting fees paid to Beatrice's PR firm for work that was never rendered. I know every single dirty, incompetent secret of Pendleton Global. And that is why, Arthur, part of the restructuring agreement dictates that you are immediately terminated as Chief Executive Officer, effective Monday morning." Beatrice slammed her hands on the table, rattling the crystal. "You little liar! You jealous, spiteful little liar!" She was practically hyperventilating, the emerald green satin of her dress heaving. "You are just a clerk. You couldn't possibly do this. Arthur, tell them she's lying." Arthur didn't say a word. He was frantically scrolling through his own phone now, pulling up his emails, his hands trembling violently. "Check your secure server, Arthur," I suggested helpfully. "Sylvia Carmichael sent the official notice to your legal team an hour ago. I'm sure your general counsel has left you about a dozen voicemails by now." As if on cue, Arthur's phone began to vibrate on the table. The caller ID flashed brightly for everyone to see. "David Kent, General Counsel." Arthur stared at the phone as if it were a live grenade. He didn't pick it up. He just sat there, utterly paralyzed, the reality of his total ruin crashing down on him in real time. Gregory Townsend, the wealthy investor Arthur had been desperately trying to woo all night, slowly stood up from his chair. He picked up his napkin, wiped his mouth meticulously, and tossed it onto his plate. "Well," Gregory said, his voice completely devoid of the warm camaraderie he had shown Arthur 10 minutes prior. "This has been an incredibly enlightening evening. Arthur, I believe Fiona and I will be taking our leave." "Greg, wait, please," Arthur begged, finding his voice, panic edging into his tone. "This is just a misunderstanding, a temporary restructuring. Save it, Arthur," Gregory said coldly. He walked around the table, deliberately bypassing Arthur entirely, and stopped behind my chair. He reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a heavy cardstock business card, and placed it gently next to my water glass. "Chloe, was it? Senior Vice President?" "Yes, Mr. Townsend," I said, looking up at him. "Sterling Vanguard makes ruthless moves. I respect that," Gregory said, a predatory smile touching his lips. When you're finished stripping Pendleton Global down to its copper wiring and restructuring the supply chain assets, give my office a call. I'd be very interested in discussing the new valuation under competent management. I'll have my assistant reach out on Tuesday, Gregory, I replied smoothly. Excellent. Good evening, Chloe. With that, Gregory and Fiona Townsend walked out of the dining room. Their departure was the catalyst. It was like watching rats flee a sinking luxury liner. One by one, the other wealthy investors, the friends who were only there to leech off Arthur's perceived power, began to make their excuses. Murmurs of early flights and babysitters filled the room as they hastily abandoned the table. Within 5 minutes, the massive dining room was entirely empty, save for Arthur, Beatrice, my parents, cousin Greg, who looked too terrified to move, and me. The silence that settled over the room was fundamentally different. Earlier, it was the anticipation of a cruel joke. Now, it was the silence of a mausoleum. Beatrice stared at me, the heavy diamond necklace around her throat suddenly looking like a glittering shackle. The illusion of her untouchable life had just been shattered. "Why?" Beatrice finally whispered, stripping away years of PR polish. "Why would you do this to us, Chloe? To your own family?" I faced her fully. "I didn't do this to you, Beatrice. My firm identified a failing company with salvageable assets, and we acquired it. Strictly business." "Business!" Beatrice shrieked, her face twisting into rage. "You stole my husband's company. You did this out of spite, because you've always been jealous." "Jealous?" I let out a dry laugh. "Beatrice, your husband is a fraud who ran a legacy business into the ground to buy you emeralds. You literally stood up 10 minutes ago and called me the family embarrassment to a room full of strangers." "Because you are," she screamed. "No, B," I said, my voice hardening. "I am the woman who just signed the paperwork, dictating whether you get to keep this house. The mezzanine debt Arthur defaulted on? It was secured against this estate. Sterling Vanguard owns the deed to this house now." My mother let out a strangled cry. My father looked up, his face a mixture of shock and agonizing shame. "Chloe," my father started, his voice raspy. "Please, you can't put your sister out on the street." I looked at my parents, the people who had watched Beatrice belittle me for nearly 3 decades. "I'm not putting them on the street, Dad," I said, with clinical detachment. "Arthur will receive a severance package, provided he signs an NDA and a non-compete. It's enough to buy a normal house in a normal suburb. He'll have to get a real job." I stood up, picking up my clutch. "You are a monster," Beatrice hissed. "You will die alone in that pathetic little apartment." "Actually, I'm closing on a penthouse in Tribeca next month," I corrected her gently. I walked over to where my mother was weeping and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mum, Dad," I said, "I love you both. But I am done shrinking myself to make Beatrice feel big. If you want a relationship with me moving forward, it will be on equal footing. Otherwise, focus your energy on helping Arthur update his resume." I walked out. Stepping into the cool Connecticut night air, the suffocating cloak of the golden child's shadow finally fell away. The following Monday morning was a masterclass in corporate execution. I arrived at Pendleton Global Headquarters at 7:45 a.m., flanked by lawyers. When I stepped off the elevator, Arthur's administrative assistant visibly paled. "Mr. Pendleton is in his office," she stuttered. "He said he wasn't taking meetings." "That's fine," I said briskly. "It's not a meeting, it's an eviction." I pushed open the heavy glass doors. Arthur was sitting behind his desk, surrounded by cardboard boxes. His arrogant sneer was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a beaten man. "You really did it," Arthur mumbled. That is generally how hostile takeovers work, I said, dropping a folder onto his desk. These are your exit papers. You have 15 minutes to pack. After that, security escorts you out. Later that afternoon, sitting in my new corner office, my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. We are coming to the city on Thursday. Would you like to get lunch? Just the three of us. It was the first time she had initiated a plan that didn't revolve around Beatrice, a tiny crack in the family dynamic. I typed back, I'm booked solid this week with restructuring. I have an opening next Tuesday at 1 p.m. Let me know if that works. I hit send. For the first time in my life, I wasn't in the shadows. I was exactly where I belonged. That dinner changed the trajectory of my entire life. Beatrice and Arthur eventually downsized to a modest condo in New Jersey, and the distance forced my parents to finally see us as individuals, not as a superstar and a sidekick. Standing up to family is excruciating, but realizing you hold the pen to your own narrative is the most liberating power in the world. Some empires just need to fall,